Welcome to this lecture titled Theodore Roosevelt's Conflicted Legacy. I am Edward Dodson. Anyone who has taken a few courses in United States history will remember that the young Theodore Roosevelt suffered from severe asthma, an illness he worked hard to overcome in order to build physical strength and stamina as an older person. He was born on the 27th of October in 1858. This is a photograph of the family home in New York City. Theodore was the second of four children. Because of his illness, he was homeschooled by tutors and by his parents. In 1876, he was admitted to Harvard College, where he studied biology and emerged as an accomplished naturalist. He also became editor of the Harvard Advocate and graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1880, ranking 22nd out of a class of 177. With an inheritance in today's money of nearly $2 million, Theodore decided to move into his family's home and then seek a law degree at Columbia Law School. Already, however, he had decided to enter politics, running as a Republican for a seat in the New York State Assembly and defeating the machine candidate. Elected, he dropped out of law school. He married Alice Hathaway Lee in 1880. A daughter named Alice Lee was born on the 21st of February 1884. Then, just 2 days later, his wife died of kidney failure. During this period, he had also undertaken the research to document the role of the United States Navy in the War of 1812. His book on the war was published in 1882. In office, he joined in a legislative investigation into corruption of the New York City government. He successfully challenged an effort by the financier Jay Gould to have his taxes lowered and pushed for an investigation of Gould's influence on Judge Theodore Westbrook. Elected in 1882 for a second term, he emerged as the Republican Party leader in the state assembly. At the 1884 Republican National Convention, Roosevelt supported an African American named John R. Lynch to chair the convention. Lynch was the son of an Irish immigrant and an enslaved woman living in Louisiana. Although his father purchased John's freedom shortly before his death in 1849, John was sold to a white plantation owner in Mississippi. After emancipation, he became involved in Republican Party politics and was appointed a Justice of the Peace. In the 1869 election, he won a seat in the Mississippi State House of Representatives. At the 1884 convention, Lynch delivered a keynote address, quote, making him the only African American accorded such an honor at a national convention until 1968. Putting aside for the moment his political aspirations, Roosevelt decided to take up ranching in North Dakota. There, he organized area ranchers to address shared problems, including overgrazing. His commitment to conservation was clearly developing. In 1886, he was appointed a deputy sheriff in Billings County, North Dakota. Unfortunately, a severe winter destroyed his herd of cattle. He lost much of what he had invested and returned to New York City. At the end of 1886, he married for a second time to Edith Caro, a woman he had known since childhood. Their marriage would eventually produce 5 children. Republican leaders in New York City recruited him to run for mayor of the city against Henry George, the United Labor Party candidate, and Abram Hewitt, candidate of the Democratic Party. Roosevelt finished third behind Henry George. George had campaigned for less than 1 month, yet spoke to crowds all around the city again and again. Accepting the nomination of the United Labor Party at Cooper Union, he told supporters, "I believe, and I have long believed, that through politics was the way, and the only way by which anything real and permanent could be secured for labor. In that path, however, I did not expect to tread. That, I thought, would devolve upon others. But when the secretary of this nominating convention came to me and said, quote, "You are the only man upon whom we can unite, and I want you to write me a letter either accepting or refusing to accept and giving your reasons," that put a different face on the matter. In response to a letter Roosevelt received from a group of Henry George's supporters, he responded as follows: "The mass of the American people are most emphatically not in the deplorable condition of which you speak, and the statesmen and patriots of today are no more responsible for some people being poorer than others than they are for some people being shorter or more nearsighted or physically weaker than others. If you had any conception of the true American spirit, you would know we do not have classes at all on this side of the water. For example, you say I belong to the landlord class, whereas in reality I own no land at all except that on which I myself live. Some of the evils of which you complain are real and can be to a certain degree remedied, but not by the remedies you propose. Others are imaginary, and others, though real, can only be gotten over through that capacity for study, individual self-help, which is the glory of every true American, and can no more be done away with by legislation than you could do away with the bruises which you receive when you tumble down by passing an act to repeal the laws of gravitation." After the election defeat, Roosevelt set to work writing another book, the first two volumes of which were published in 1889 with the title The Winning of the West. In 1896, the historian Frederick Jackson Turner's review of the fourth and final volume appeared in the October issue of the American Historical Review. Turner thought the author had done, quote, "a real service to our history." Turner wrote, "He has rescued a whole movement in American development from the hands of unskilled analysts. He has made use of widely scattered original sources, not heretofore exploited, and with graphic vigor he has portrayed the advance of the pioneer into the wastes of the continent." President Benjamin Harrison, elected in 1888, appointed Roosevelt to the United States Civil Service Commission. He took the responsibility seriously and fought hard for enforcement of civil service laws. As evidence of Theodore's commitment to principles over politics, he was reappointed in 1892 by the new president, Grover Cleveland, a Democrat. His next challenge came in 1894 when he accepted appointment to the board of the New York City Police Commissioners and was selected as the board's president. Possessed of a legitimate social conscience after reading the book How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis, Roosevelt became an active proponent of efforts to improve the living conditions of the city's poor immigrants. The photographs of life in New York's slums presented a powerful indictment on the American system. One review at the time could not have escaped the attention of Henry George, or at least some of his supporters. Greed and reckless selfishness are given as the chief cause of this evil, for the keeping of tenements is generally a speculation, and a very paying one, to judge by the evidence given at various official inquiries. The landlords of New York are to be found in every stratum of society. The property of absentees is left in the hands of agents, whose instructions are, collect the rent in advance, or failing, eject the occupants. And it is a common saying in New York that evictions are as frequent there as in Ireland. In a long article published during 1901 in McClure's magazine, Roosevelt credited Jacob Riis with shedding bright light on the problems of the large cities. Roosevelt wrote, "The countless evils which lurk in the dark corners of our civic institutions, which stalk abroad in the slums, and have their permanent abode in the crowded tenement houses, have met in Mr. Riis the most formidable opponent ever encountered by them in New York City. To Mr. Riis was given, in addition to earnestness and zeal, the great gift of expression, the great gift of making others see what he saw and feel what he felt." Roosevelt campaigned for William McKinley during the 1896 presidential election in order to defeat William Jennings Bryan. He was opposed to Bryan's call for bimetallism and described Bryan's followers, of whom single taxers were numerous, as dangerous fanatics. Bryan made his case at the Democratic Party's National Convention. There are two ideas of government. There are those who believe that if you will only legislate to make the well-to-do prosperous, their prosperity will leak through on those below. The Democratic idea, however, has been that if you legislate to make the masses prosperous, their prosperity will find its way up through every class which rests upon them. You come to us and tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest upon our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. McKinley rewarded Roosevelt with an appointment as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1897. From this position, he pushed for an increase in the nation's naval strength. Moreover, he pressed McKinley to take action against the Spanish in Cuba and provided his views on the nation's manifest destiny in the Caribbean and the Pacific. In an article published in the March 1896 issue of the Bachelor of Arts, Roosevelt defended the Monroe Doctrine as, quote, a broad general principle of living policy. He added this: the Monroe Doctrine may be briefly defined as forbidding European encroachment on American soil. The United States has not the slightest wish to establish a universal protectorate over other American states or become responsible for their misdeeds. Roosevelt's desires came to fruition after the USS Maine exploded while anchored in the harbor of Havana, Cuba. Without orders from McKinley, he ordered a squadron to the area. War erupted in April, and Roosevelt resigned his post and began to form a new regiment the press called the Rough Riders. The Rough Riders arrived in Cuba on the 23rd of June. Roosevelt was promoted to colonel and took command. At the Battle of Kettle Hill, the Rough Riders forced the Spanish to abandon their positions. In his autobiography, Roosevelt reflected on the reasons the United States was ill-prepared going into this war with Spain. There are nations who only need to have peaceful ideals inculcated, and to whom militarism is a curse and a misfortune. There are other nations, like our own, so happily situated that the thought of war is never present to their minds. They are wholly free from any tendency, improperly, to exalt or to practice militarism. Our people are not military. We need normally only a small standing army, but there should be behind it a reserve of instructed men big enough to fill it up to full war strength, which is over twice the peace strength. Roosevelt was now a national figure, and he welcomed the opportunity to express his views on the political issues of the day. In an article published in the September 1896 issue of Review of Reviews, he discussed the role of the vice president. The presidency being all important, and the vice presidency of comparatively little note, the entire strength of the contending factions is spent in the conflict over the first, and very often a man who is most anxious to take the first place will not take the second, preferring some other political position. It has thus frequently happened that the two candidates have been totally dissimilar in character and even in party principle, though both running on the same ticket. Very odd results have followed in more than one instance. After his regiment was removed from Cuba in August and Roosevelt was decommissioned, Republican leaders quickly approached him to run in the election for the next governor of New York State. As revealed in this brief passage from his autobiography, he had little tolerance for what he understood to be extremism. There is a lunatic fringe to every reform movement. At least 9/10 of all the sincere reformers supported me, but the ultra-pacifists, the so-called anti-imperialists, or anti-militarists, or peace at any price men, preferred my opponent to me. He also had something of importance to say in response to reformers who expressed deep concern over the extremes of wealth and poverty existing in the country. In the January 1897 issue of Review of Reviews, Roosevelt responded to concerns raised in a letter he received from Populist Party vice presidential candidate Thomas E. Watson. Watson had written, "I think the men who run a bank, a factory, a railroad, or a foundry should make all the profit in business he fairly can. But I do believe that the bank should not exercise the sovereign power of issuing money, and I do believe that all special privileges granted and all exemption from taxation work infinite harm. I do believe that the wealth of the Republic is practically free from federal taxation, and that the burdens of government fall upon the shoulders of those least able to bear them." Roosevelt's response conveyed his faith in the American system as offering the best outcomes that could be expected. There are plenty of ugly things about wealth and its possessors in the present age, and I suppose there have been in all ages. But, on the whole, the thrifty are apt to be better citizens than the thriftless, and the worst capitalists cannot harm laboring men as they are harmed by demagogues. As the people of a state grow more and more intelligent, the state itself must be able to play a larger and larger part in the life of the community, while at the same time, individual effort may be given freer and less restricted movement along certain lines. But it is utterly unsafe to give the state more than the minimum power, just so long as it contains masses of men who can be moved by the pleas and denunciations of the average socialist leader of today. There may be better schemes of taxation than those at present employed. It may be wise to devise inheritance taxes and to impose regulations on the kinds of business which can be carried on only under the especial protection of the state. And where there is a real abuse by wealth, it needs to be, and in this country generally has been, promptly done away with. But the first lesson to teach the poor man is that, as a whole, the wealth in the community is distinctly beneficial to him, that he is better off in the long run because other men are well off, and that the surest way to destroy what measure of prosperity he may have is to paralyze industry and the well-being of those men who have achieved success. It was in the governor's office that he now began to study economic issues and the harm done by the trusts, other monopolies, and their alliances with entrenched political bosses. Roosevelt later reflected on his approach to getting things accomplished. "I always did my best in good faith to get heads of the machine to accept my views and to convince them, by repeated private conversations, that I was right. I never wantonly antagonized or humiliated them. I did not wish to humiliate them or to seem victorious over them. What I wished was to secure the things that I thought it essential to the men and women of the state to secure." Theodore's political smarts as governor is described by historian Robert Wesser. Though Roosevelt certainly felt uncomfortable about a system which was antithetical to his reformist inclinations, he could and did play the game well enough to succeed without sacrificing principle or perspective. His years as governor give ample proof of his ability to exercise strong, forward-looking leadership and yet maintain a working relationship with a group of ultra-conservative, oft-times irresponsible party leaders. Yet his administration introduced few pieces of reform legislation. New York reformers felt betrayed by his failure to take on the New York political machine. An early major fight occurred with the powerful U.S. Senator for New York, Thomas Platt, over the reappointment of key state officials. Yet some insight into Theodore's values was revealed in the June 1900 issue of The Century, in which he expressed his contempt for those men with slightly disordered mentalities who champion reforms as a kind of tribute to their own righteousness. On occasion, it might be necessary to cut loose and stand alone for a great cause, but the necessity for such action is almost as rare as the necessity for revolution. Sometimes it is a sign of highest statesmanship to temporize. Once in office, he sought reform of the state civil service law, called for increased inspection of factories and for stricter enforcement of labor laws. He also took on the taxation of public service corporations that enjoyed perpetual franchises, writing, "Taxation, especially in New York City, was rapidly becoming more and more burdensome, and there appeared to be no sufficient reason for exempting valuable corporate franchises from paying their fair share of the public expenses." Senator Platt made sure the bill died in committee. Theodore called for a special session of the legislature for the purpose of passing an amended statute, which they did and the governor signed. The amended bill achieved two objectives, according to William Draper Lewis. He believed that the value of franchises should be assessed by a state board instead of by local authorities, and that provision should be made for crediting the corporations with any tax which they already paid under existing laws. During the 1900 legislative year, Theodore obtained permission to appoint a commission to investigate tenement house conditions in New York City. He sought the creation of a state hospital to treat people who developed tuberculosis, and he established a policy of protecting the state's forests. In its relations with other peoples, the United States was embarking on an expansion of what some felt to be the nation's manifest destiny, while others saw the nation joining the ranks of imperial powers. A first step in 1898 was the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands, partly out of concern that Japan might do so first. 2 years later, the U.S. added the Philippines to what looked like a growing empire. At the Republican National Convention in 1900, Roosevelt was drafted to become vice president in the second McKinley administration. Again, campaigning, he did his best to portray Bryan and Bryanism as radical. As the 1900 election approached, he provided his views on the U.S. presence in the Philippines. Under Spanish rule, the Filipinos were treated with intolerable cruelty. The Aquinaldian leaders have, wherever their power has extended, continued a system almost as bad. So far as I am aware, not one competent witness who has actually known the facts believes the Filipinos capable of self-government at present, or believes that such an effort would result in anything but a horrible confusion of tyranny and anarchy. I do believe that if Bryan and his sympathizers cannot make their campaign without such acts and speech as are traitorous to the government in time of war, it would be more generous and noble to hold their opinions in abeyance until we can straighten out this tangle. If Bryan is defeated and the country gives the administration the right support, we can finish up this job without great loss of American life and without great punishment to the natives. William Jennings Bryan, for his part, denounced the annexation of the Philippines as unconstitutional. In a speech delivered 10 April 1900, he defined the continued U.S. occupation of the Philippines as evidence the U.S. had become one more imperialist power. Bryan stated, "There is a difference between expansion and imperialism. Expansion is the extension of the limits of a republic without a change of its character. Imperialism is the policy of an empire. We have expanded before. We never had imperialism before. We expanded when we took in Florida. We expanded when we took in the Louisiana Territory. We expanded when we took in Texas and New Mexico and California. But today, it is not expansion. It is not taking in land that can be settled by American citizens and built up into American states. It is going across an ocean to get not land for settlement, but races for subjugation. Heretofore, we have extended the area of the Republic, and every citizen has enjoyed the protection of the flag and the Constitution. But the Republican Party now wants this nation to enter into a career of imperialism. 6 months into his second term, President McKinley was assassinated while attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. To reassure Republican leaders that he would adhere to the party platform, Roosevelt retained McKinley's entire cabinet. Louis F. Post, editor of The Public, gave the new president some time to find his way before offering his assessment of, quote, Mr. Roosevelt's administration. However, the president seemed already on a course Post believed to be dangerous to democracy. In the 7 December 1901 issue, Post wrote, "What President Roosevelt is evidently reaching out for in his demand for federal laws against anarchy is centralized power for the suppression of opinions which he and his class do not approve, and the arbitrary punishment of men whom they dislike." In an editorial that covered 2 full pages of The Public, Post worried that Roosevelt was moving to curtail economic as well as personal freedom. Centralization is indeed the dominant note of Mr. Roosevelt's message. Besides urging federal jurisdiction over assaults upon federal officials, it proposes a new cabinet officer whose function it shall be to permanently governmentalize American industries, a step in the direction of socialism which state socialists in their wildest dreams could not have hoped for so soon. More Americans were lining up to question the new president's, quote, American values. Roosevelt soon angered racist whites by meeting with Booker T. Washington at the White House. He had known Washington for some time and was supportive of his work at Tuskegee, actually stating that, quote, the salvation of the Negro lay in the development of the Booker-Washington theory. And in 1903, he suggested in a letter made public that there should be no racial discrimination in the hiring of public servants, writing, "I certainly cannot treat mere color as a permanent bar to holding office, any more than I could so treat creed or birthplace, always provided that in other respects the applicant or incumbent is a worthy and well-behaved American citizen." As governor of New York, he had brought an end to segregation in the state's public schools. As president, he appointed Robert Terrell, an African American, to the office of Justice of the Peace in the District of Columbia. And in 1905, Roosevelt sent this remarkable letter, resulting in the appointment of an African American attorney named Charles W. Anderson to the position of Collector of Internal Revenues for the 2nd District of New York. Yet, as Dewey Grantham Jr. wrote in the June 1958 issue of the Tennessee Historical Society, despite Roosevelt's defiance of the Southerners in the friendly company of his friends, he invited no more Negroes to dine at the White House. Furthermore, he went to considerable lengths to point out that he had appointed fewer Negroes and more white Democrats to federal positions than any previous Republican president. Historian Michael Patrick Cullinane concludes, however, that this hardly scratches the surface of where Roosevelt stood on the question of racial equality as this applied to life in the United States. He worried that the low birth rate among some Americans was leading to, quote, race suicide. More specifically, his concern was that those of demonstrated ability among whites were not having many children. On the economic front, he now sought to make use of provisions of the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act to rein in the monopoly power of the trusts. The act had become law while Theodore was serving on the U.S. Civil Service Commission. The principal author of the act was John Sherman, the United States Senator from Ohio and former Secretary of the Treasury under Rutherford B. Hayes. Sherman had taken up the issue 2 years earlier, working to build support. Sherman biographer Theodore Burton described Sherman as both principled and an effective politician. His thought was of principles and policies rather than of men, of the aggregate made up of all the people rather than of individuals. To him, men who were entrusted with the administration of affairs were merely the agents of the people in great public movements. Somewhat surprisingly, there is no mention in Burton's biography of Sherman to any relationship with Henry George, Tom L. Johnson, or any indication Sherman publicly expressed a view for or against a single tax. Johnson, a firm supporter of Henry George's ideas, had been elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1890 and again in 1892 before becoming mayor of Cleveland, Ohio. As he began his term as president, Theodore Roosevelt was fully aware of public concern over the rapidly consolidating character of the nation's industrial and financial enterprises. At the same time, he had no desire to use government more aggressively than absolutely necessary. As Texas A&M University professor Leroy Dorsey wrote in a 1995 article, with social order as his overriding concern, President Roosevelt used the bully pulpit to urge restraint by both big business and its muckraking critics and to lessen the attendant apprehension of the American people. Professor Dorsey points out that at least one biographer, Henry Pringle, argues that Theodore's, quote, image as a trust buster was an exaggeration. Pringle points out that the president initiated only 25 suits under the Sherman Antitrust Act, while his successor, William Howard Taft, started 45. Professor Dorsey disagrees. Roosevelt actually accomplished a great deal. He did not break up many trusts, but he did provide a sympathetic ear and a powerful voice for the unfocused discontent of the country regarding the growth and abusive practices of corporations and trusts. With his public rhetoric, the president led a symbolic crusade against impersonal and amoral forces. Theodore joined with others who believed that the railroad combinations were the most immoral and most corrupt. Thus, Northern Securities Company, the nation's largest railroad monopoly controlled by J.P. Morgan, James Hill, and Edward Harriman, stood out as a serious threat to the nation's market system. That John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil benefited enormously by lower rail charges than other producers justified antitrust action against the two giants. More broadly, Theodore promised the country a, quote, square deal. At the time Theodore Roosevelt became president, Standard Oil of New Jersey served as the holding company of stocks in 41 other companies. The details were made public by Ida Tarbell, the managing editor of McClure's magazine, beginning in November 1902. Articles appeared for 24 months and were then published in book form. It took until the end of 1906 for the Roosevelt administration to assemble all of the evidence required to bring suit against Standard Oil. It took 3 more years of testimony before Standard Oil was ordered to be dissolved. The decision was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, but the court overturned a $29 million fine levied by the lower court. Much else was happening during those first years in office. A major domestic problem erupted in May of 1902 when anthracite coal miners went on strike and remained out for 10 months. Roosevelt intervened to broker a deal that gave workers the 8-hour workday and increased their pay, adding another victory for the square deal. In 1903, his administration took on the issue of land fraud and speculation in the General Land Office. The commissioner was forced to resign, and cases of bribery were brought against officials in Oregon. including U.S. Senator John H. Mitchell. Although convicted, Mitchell died in 1905 while his conviction was being appealed. At the public, Louis F. Post was following closely both the public statements and the actions taken by Roosevelt and his administration. After Roosevelt delivered his State of the Union message early in 1904, Post cautioned readers to think critically about the superficiality of Roosevelt's thinking. What interests us most in Mr. Roosevelt's speech is his economic suggestions. With his objection to establishing a line of cleavage dividing those who are well off from those who are less well off, we are in hearty sympathy. The true line of cleavage for society to draw is not between rich and poor, nor good and bad, nor is it between persons at all. It is between natural freedom of economic opportunity on the one hand and legalized privilege on the other. At one point, Mr. Roosevelt seems to recognize dimly the essential propriety of this line of cleavage, for he remarks that materially we must strive to secure a broader economic opportunity for all men. But whatever encouragement might be drawn from this remark is dampened by Mr. Roosevelt's advocacy of a progressive tax intended to prevent the transfer of large fortunes beyond a certain amount to any one individual. Curiously enough, Mr. Roosevelt proposes this confiscatory measure for all fortunes, utterly regardless of how they are won, in almost the same breath in which he insists upon discriminating between fortunes well won and fortunes ill won. For Theodore Roosevelt, the Monroe Doctrine was still in effect. European powers were to be kept out of the Western Hemisphere entirely. Consistent with this position, the United States intervened to enable Panama to break free of Colombia and set the stage for the U.S. control over the Canal Zone, which he visited in 1906. In his autobiography, he recalled, "I took the isthmus, started the canal, and then left Congress not to debate the canal, but to debate me." Louis F. Post saw the president's actions in a very different light. Great financial interests in Wall Street, very powerful in a presidential year, have $40 million in cash at stake on the Panama route. And only Satan himself knows how much more in progressive land values along that route. With what apprehension must sober Americans contemplate the fame of their country after impartial history shall have dealt with recent events and explained their manifest inconsistency. For reformers as well as Roosevelt, the railroads eventually became a target of reform as new powers to regulate rates were granted to the Interstate Commerce Commission under the Hepburn Act of 1906. That same year, he signed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. To many, he was in fact carrying a big stick. Roosevelt's work with Gifford Pinchot, chief of the U.S. Forest Service, resulted in the creation of 5 national parks, 18 new national monuments, 150 national forests, and many bird and game preserves. Pinchot, it is worth noting, solicited from single taxers in 1916 their help in defeating a bill that would have granted to power companies the use of water power on navigable streams without compensation to society. In total, some 230 million acres of land was thus placed under public protection during Roosevelt's presidency. As the 20th century slowly advanced, so did the stresses caused by monopoly of and speculation in land and natural resources. Yet, on the verge of the coming financial and economic crisis, there were few alarms sounded. A few editorials during 1916 in the public provided hints that all was not well. The New York Sun has seen that the increases in rent during the past 2 years, which have probably averaged at least $2 or $3 a month per family, have taken that much out of the earnings of the people, that much from their effective demand for commodities. It sees in the large rush of the better paid classes of wage earners to escape the landlord by becoming homeowners, another substantial cut in effective demand, for these must enter upon a regime of economy in order to pay for their homes. It shows that goods made to be sold will not be sold, or will be sold slowly, and that an overstocked market will curtail production, throwing many out of work and wages of any kind. And now a word from us. Single taxers have never had a better opportunity for establishing reputations as statesmen who can see ahead. The smash is coming, sure as fate. They will not bring it about. It is not their fault, and they cannot help it. But they can explain what will bring it about. And when it comes, they can truthfully say, as prophets and not as croakers, "We told you so." Roosevelt was ill-equipped to respond to the problem. Counter to his antitrust stance, he encouraged executives of U.S. Steel to acquire a nearly bankrupt steel company in Tennessee in an effort to restore investor confidence. All he could think of to do was to call out against the wealthy, referring to them as malefactors of great wealth. More specifically, he stated, "It may be that the determination of the government to punish certain malefactors of great wealth has been responsible for something of the trouble, at least to the extent of having caused these men to combine to bring about as much financial stress as possible in order to discredit the policy of the government and thereby secure a reversal of that policy so that they may enjoy unmolested the fruits of their own evil doing." Those in academia who continue to embrace the values-based analysis of political economy over that of values-free economics are fast being replaced. A rare few would somehow find their way to Henry George's macroeconomic analysis despite acquiring the credentials of an economist. One of the most influential would be Harry Gunnison Brown. Brown's insights would emerge slowly after completing his doctorate at Yale University in 1909. This was 2 years after the effects of the nation's deeply entrenched pattern of rent-seeking privileges exploded into the Panic of 1907. So we have nothing from Harry Gunnison Brown written during the Panic. Stock prices began to fall early in the year, and the economy quickly slid into recession. One professor of economics who offered an explanation of the panic's cause was Joseph French Johnson at New York University. His article, "The Crisis and Panic of 1907, appeared in the September 1908 issue of Political Science Quarterly. He wrote, "Crises are doubtless inevitable, for the conditions leading up to them could be prevented only by more than human combination of sagacity and discretion. Panics, however, are unnecessary. They are almost invariably the product of remediable effects of the credit system." He then made his most important observation. During 1905 and 1906, there came to light evidence that a considerable portion of the public was willing to take long chances in real estate, in mines, and in numerous other enterprises of a speculative nature. Of course, even back then, an economic contraction generally meant extreme deprivation for the poorest citizen, whether white or persons of color. Newly arrived immigrants comprised a disproportionate percentage of the poorest of the poor. In the autumn 1907 issue of the Single Tax Review, Lewis F. Post labeled conditions in the nation as class warfare. Post wrote, "The imminence of class warfare can no longer be blinked by any observant and thoughtful person. It is the conflict of economy interests which a regime of privilege has generated that is producing this clash of classes. Political lines are already forming. not on the issue of right and justice as we would have them form, but on that of power and self-interest, irrespective of right and justice. Power and self-interest was also found at the heart of the nation's racist attitudes pervasive in the Roosevelt administration. Racism dictated policies against not only persons of African heritage, but also against Asians as well. Yet, as the Japanese Empire displayed its growing military prowess and its own imperialist objectives, Theodore Roosevelt sought to improve relations by clamping down on discrimination against Japanese immigrants on the West Coast. An agreement was signed in November of 1908, which affirmed Japanese control of Korea and U.S. control of the Philippines. However, Roosevelt soon concluded that the United States should withdraw from the Philippines, which he judged to be militarily indefensible. The United States finally did withdraw, of course, but only after defeat at the hands of the Japanese, and only temporarily. Another foreign policy issue was resolved when Britain and the United States settled the border between Canada and Alaska. Roosevelt had even more troubling issues to deal with at home. After a regiment of African American soldiers was accused of causing a riot in Texas where one white person was killed, the president had the entire regiment dishonorably discharged. Included were many soldiers near retirement and several who held the Medal of Honor. All lost their retirement benefits. Investigators questioned the statements of white witnesses, given the fact that the black soldiers had been required for their own safety to adhere to a strict curfew that evening. An inspection of the soldiers' weapons confirmed that none of them had discharged any ammunition. It took until 1972 for the Department of Defense to admit the soldiers had been wrongfully discharged. However, no financial compensation was made available for the survivors or their families. Roosevelt's second term ended in March of 1909. He honored tradition by not seeking a third term. He persuaded William Howard Taft, with whom he was a close friend, to head the Republican Party ticket. William Jennings Bryan was his Democratic Party opponent. Taft won with 51.6% of the vote. Supporting Bryan all the way, the public reported on his activities in every weekly issue, and most single taxers supported his candidacy, even though, as the following editorial after the election indicated, Bryan disappointed them on what to do about the economy. His single tax supporters have not been unmindful of the fallibility of his economic judgments and the shallowness of his proposed remedies. The trust plank in the Denver platform, said to have been dictated by Mr. Bryan, is of all remedies the most preposterous, and it was upon this most vulnerable part of his armor that Governor Hughes, who on the Republican side made the most effective speeches in this campaign, directed his heaviest artillery. Repeated efforts have been made to draw Mr. Bryan out with some expression of opinion on the right of every man to the use of the earth, without which the discussion of any economic problem is waste of effort. Almost immediately after his term ended, Theodore Roosevelt left the country for a long hunting trip in Africa, then toured Europe before returning to the United States. He made his way to England during the spring of 1910, meeting with leaders of the Liberal Party, Lloyd George, Henry Asquith, and Edward Grey. Lloyd George discussed with Roosevelt the objectives behind the People's Budget of 1909, over which liberals and conservatives were deeply divided. An English single taxer named John Bagot summarized the situation in Britain in an article appearing in the November-December 1909 issue of the Single Tax Review. He wrote, "The other day, Josiah Wedgwood promoted a member's petition to the government asking them to tax land values in their next budget, and this was signed by 245 members of the House of Commons, including almost all the Labour members. If those 245 members have backbone, Josiah has, the government will be as potter's clay in their hands. This great work can be accomplished without allying ourselves with any party. Indeed, that is the only way in which it can be accomplished. It cannot be obtained by stealth, smuggled through incidentally in some omnibus bill promoted by a political caucus. It is the greatest reform of modern times, and as such must be fought for as a distinct issue. On the trip back to the United States, Roosevelt read Herbert Croly's book, The Promise of American Life, which had an immediate impact on him. It was from Croly that Roosevelt adopted the phrase, the new nationalism. At home, the most pressing domestic issue was the fate of the nation's monetary system. The Aldrich Monetary Commission was ready to propose creation of a central bank to take responsibility for managing the money supply and regulating nationally chartered banks. There were still many issues to be resolved, but the lessons of the 1907 panic were clear to many. The nation needed a stable money supply. The legislation would be signed in 1913 by Woodrow Wilson, creating the Federal Reserve System of private central banks. Meanwhile, in the United States, progressives were coming together in an effort to make William Howard Taft a one-term president. A national meeting of these dissidents was held on the 21st of January 1911, leading to the creation of the National Progressive Republican League. The group backed Senator Robert M. La Follette of Wisconsin as their candidate in the 1912 presidential race. As for Roosevelt, biographer George Mowry explains the position in which he found himself. Roosevelt was on trial before the progressives of the country. If Roosevelt produced a program of concrete remedies for the present evils, he might capture the Republican nomination. In June of 1910, a meeting was held in St. Paul, Minnesota, where the first discussion occurred regarding the possibility of creating a new third party. George Mowry explains just how risky this would be to Roosevelt to publicly oppose Taft, alienate close friends, and probably contribute to victory for the Democratic Party candidate. Yet he was becoming increasingly frustrated by Taft's decisions and the policy directions taken by the administration. Roosevelt came home thoroughly convinced that Taft, though sincere, had permitted reactionary forces to lead him into a position that had inevitably occasioned the revolt of the progressive faction. Conferences with progressive leaders sustained that judgment. Mowry continues, Roosevelt was condemning his successor not for being a conservative, but rather for not being a politician. Distraught as he was over the state of the party, Roosevelt determined to devote the summer to bringing the two wings together. He made it clear, after repeated calls for help from both sides in the primary fights, that he intended to eschew all factional struggles. Through conferences and letters, he argued Gifford Pinchot out of his desire to form a new third party. Nevertheless, Theodore decided to tour the western states, delivering addresses to huge crowds and explaining to Americans what his principles of new nationalism would mean to their daily lives. He stated, "The man who wrongly holds that every human right is secondary to his profit must now give way to the advocate of human welfare, who rightfully maintains that every man holds his property subject to the general right of the community to regulate its use to whatever degree the public welfare may require it." In an effort to bring down the cost of food and stimulate exports of manufactured goods, Taft agreed to reduce tariffs on goods coming from Canada, conditioned on reciprocity by the Canadians. Progressives opposed the agreement because they believed it would harm farmers, and many in Canada also saw the agreement as harmful to segments of the Canadian economy. The bill passed in the United States Congress, but failed in Canada. The split between progressives and conservatives within the Republican Party continued to grow during the 2 years leading up to the 1912 presidential election. Roosevelt remained in the background, doubtful the party could retain the presidency. George Mallory tells us that Roosevelt was set to work after the election to rebuild the party. Mallory says, when everything was weighed in the balance, the views of the conservatives, Roosevelt felt, were not quite as erroneous as those of the radicals. As for the ultra-radicals who sought to defeat Taft for the renomination, they were traveling the road toward the company of single taxers and prohibitionists. The right thing to do was to renominate Taft and face defeat, and then reorganize under some progressive leadership. Roosevelt returned to politics in 1912, first challenging William Howard Taft for the Republican Party nomination. Taft began to fight back, referring to Roosevelt's theories of government as crude and even revolutionary. He accused Roosevelt of stirring up class hatred. During 1911, however, Roosevelt gained state delegates, which prompted even more strident attacks on him by Taft and Taft supporters. Roosevelt's nomination strengthened with victory in Ohio, then in New Jersey. However, the way the candidates were chosen was not based on who won the most delegates at open primaries. The National Republican Committee was the deciding organ, and George Mallory makes note of the fact that, quote, its members had been chosen from loyal Taft supporters, and in the end, Taft secured the nomination by manipulation. Roosevelt and his supporters broke off to form the Progressive Bull Moose Party. Roosevelt now called for a program of greater government regulation over the economy and for an expanded system of social welfare. He gambled that progressive Republicans would leave to join him. That did not happen. Roosevelt campaigned in support of systemic reforms that included direct election of United States senators, the initiative, referendum, and recall, women's suffrage, the regulation of interstate commerce, creation of a Federal Securities Commission, a simplification of the process of amending the Constitution, and a land monopoly tax. With this list, he was just getting started. Southern progressives continued to be driven by racial prejudice, and they worried that Roosevelt would pursue policies securing greater political rights for persons of color. Roosevelt equivocated. He stated, I earnestly believe that by appealing to the best white men of the South, and by frankly putting the movement into their hands from the outset, we shall create a situation by which the colored man of the South will ultimately get justice, as it is not possible for them to get justice if we are to continue and perpetuate the present conditions. Unfortunately, with this strategy, he ended up losing the support of black voters in the North. Woodrow Wilson emerged victorious with a strong majority vote. Roosevelt received some 700,000 more votes than Taft, which was at least some satisfaction. Roosevelt now retired to his home and began writing his autobiography. Then, on the 9th of December, he traveled to Chicago to attend the Progressive Conference. He urged making the effort to create a permanent party. Responding to the potential challenge, Woodrow Wilson's first legislative success was reduction of the tariff, the first significant reduction since the 1860s. When Amos Pinchot lobbied for Perkins' resignation, Roosevelt responded angrily and threatened to leave if Perkins was forced from the party. Roosevelt wrote in a letter to Pinchot, quote, when I spoke of the Progressive Party as having a lunatic fringe, I specifically had you in mind. After the election of 1914, only one progressive was returned to the U.S. House of Representatives. But this was 1914, and war had erupted on the European continent. Roosevelt privately expressed a view that the war had been inevitable given the state of international relations. He argued for a strengthening of the nation's armed forces. Fairly quickly, Roosevelt condemned Germany as the aggressor and expressed support for Britain, France, and the Allied powers. Those who disagreed with him, he dismissed as out of touch with reality or were Americans of German heritage. Early in January of 1916, at a meeting of the National Defense League, Roosevelt called for building the Army to 2 million men and a significant increase in naval ships. At the same time, he argued that the national government must support industrial expansion. He wrote that the most positive aspect of German culture was that the German government had, quote, taken care of her working classes while at the same time taking care of her business interests. Roosevelt did not attend the Progressive Party's convention in 1916. The platform was essentially the same as that of the Republican Party. Perkins was attempting to broker Roosevelt's nomination in both parties. The Republicans rejected the idea and selected Charles Evans Hughes. Roosevelt withdrew from the contest. In the general election, Hughes narrowly lost to Woodrow Wilson. When the United States entered into the First World War, Roosevelt was eager to command a division in France, but was denied the opportunity by Secretary of War Newton Baker and by President Wilson. George Mallory tells us that Roosevelt, quote, was as unfair as any man consumed with anger can be. He would find reason to align with anyone who opposed Wilson. Roosevelt now believed that a Republican Congress and a Republican president were key to preserving the American system, protecting the nation from the rise of Bolshevism. He was encouraged when Republicans won a narrow majority in the U.S. Senate. It is worth reminding everyone that the nation was at the time going through the devastating flu pandemic. Roosevelt's own health was failing. He spent the month of February in the hospital, and in November he returned to the hospital bed. His condition seemed to improve, and he returned to his home a few days before Christmas. Then, with essentially no warning, he suddenly died early in the morning of the 6th of January, 1919. Among the many persons who came forward with remembrance of Theodore Roosevelt was the former Secretary of War and Secretary of State during Roosevelt's presidency, Elijah Root. This was published in the December 1919 issue of the North American Review. The excerpts that follow strike me as coming from someone with whom Roosevelt shared most views about the nation's role in the global arena. He saw that in the marvelous development of human wealth and human power to produce wealth, we had gradually slipped away from the old, simple relations of equality among our people, that a crust was forming of power and privilege and superiority based on wealth, and a steadily, certainly growing discontent was making its way among the people of our country. And he undertook, though there was no crisis, to make one, and to bring the people of America back to the supremacy of law for liberty. The millions who were beginning to feel that our free institutions were failing, he taught to understand that there was a remedy by law, and he forced a passage through the difficulties, doubts, and obstacles for law and for the application of the great principles of free government through law. And of course, Lewis F. Post had some final thoughts on Roosevelt as well. Roosevelt was never a profound thinker in the political or any other field. His ideas were the mediocre, commonplace stock of the ordinary man. He never analyzed or criticized them. He adopted the ordinary intellectual furniture of the average American, gave it at every turn the character of a moral issue, placed behind it the driving force of unwavering conviction, and then proceeded fearlessly to translate it into action. Everything he touched became instantly human and personal. The editor of the Single Tax Review added this: at the beginning of his career, he was the close friend of Ernest Howard Crosby, and it was this chapter of his work for the reform of the civil service in association with the man who later became one of the high-minded leaders of the single tax movement that can now be recalled with a special honor to the memory of the ex-president. It is only fitting that I leave the last word on Roosevelt to George Maury, from whose biography many of the above details of Roosevelt's life were drawn. Theodore Roosevelt had done much for the evolution of progressive politics in the United States. In the days of its infancy, he had lent the progressive movement the prestige of his great name. Without his support of varying intensity, many progressive proposals would not have been written into statutes between 1901 and 1909. Roosevelt's New Nationalism and the Progressive Platform of 1912 were in themselves major steps in the development of progressive principles. Thank you.